President Joe Biden's approval rating remains near rock bottom as Americans now squarely blame him for America's economic and inflation woes, according to the latest News Nation Decision Desk HQ poll released Thursday. It found that 97% of Americans are concerned about inflation. 72% of respondents believe inflation is the biggest problem facing the United States. 42% blame President Biden for the state of the U.S. economy. Data Science Director at Decision Desk HQ, Scott Tranter, joins us now to discuss. Scott, welcome to Rising.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
And so your poll also found the lowest concern about about COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. Is that being pushed out, you think, by concerns about the economy, or do you think that it reflects kind of a genuine kind of moving on from on the part of the American people?
It's a genuine moving on by the public. Some of the other questions News Nation has been tracking the last 6 months is this something you're worried about for your friends and family, which is a good barometer for whether or not people think this is something they need to worry about. That was above 50% this time last year. Today it's below 30%. So by and large, people are less and less worried about COVID, but they certainly are worried about inflation.
Scott, this question so we have in these numbers, 42% of people blame President Biden for the state of the U.S. economy. Can you tell us how independents are breaking on that particular question and also on the general question of Biden approval ratings?
Sure. Well, let's start with the last one, Biden approval ratings. This is the lowest it's been for Biden on a split since News Nation started tracking in the first part of this year, back in January for the first State of the Union. And, where independents are is they split 50-50, and there aren't that many true independents left. I'm sure it's been debated quite a bit. But they largely believe that the government needs to do something about inflation. Whether that's true or not is a different question. But independents generally believe the government should be doing more. They square that on President Biden. And then secondarily, they square it on their state and local officials. But independents generally are of the opinion now government and specifically the president need to do more.
That's it. That's interesting. So you're finding it's less that they blame him for causing the inflation, but they're more frustrated by what they see as kind of an absentee approach to inflation. Like Richard Nixon, for instance, famously did all sorts of things. And some of it actually worked for a time period. And you can argue about what its long-term implications were. But price controls, who did was it Ford who did whip inflation? Now, he was very kind of ceremonially attacking
Correct.
Inflation. He was there on the job. He was going to do something about it. You don't see that from Biden. So is that more that it's not that they're blaming, say, like the child tax credit or the stimulus checks in the CARES Act for inflation. What they're saying is Biden isn't trying to do anything.
Yeah, well, President Biden, they've released petroleum from the strategic reserve. They've tried certain things, not all the things you listed there. And they're certainly talking about it a whole lot. But yeah, I think voters are expecting more from their government, and more specifically from the president. I think it's a little bit of a circular self-feeding prophecy here. You hear the president speak about this all the time in his speeches. And he, I hear your concern. I want to do something about it. And then it doesn't do anything about it. And so I think voters are responding like, well, thank you for mentioning it, but what are you going to do about it since you mentioned it?
Another number that Ryan mentioned was 72% of respondents believe inflation is the biggest problem facing the United States. And it seems like an obvious point, but the way these polls work is you put all of these different issues in front of the respondents and they gravitate towards that one. How has this compared with past responses? Were people saying education or healthcare or different answers before? And how has this number increased? I'm assuming it's been pretty rapid.
Yeah. So if we were doing number one issue a year ago, right around this time, it still would have been COVID, but it wouldn't have been in the high 70s. It would have been in the high 60s. And so 70s is pretty unprecedented. I'm sure we could find some issue, in pockets of healthcare and things like that 10 years ago. But 70% of inflation is pretty big. And then when you add in the somewhat concerns, you get into the 90s, which is a very eye-popping number, but it's logical, right? Whether you're paying double for gas or you're paying triple for that, expensive hotel room or whatever it is, it hits all incomes, all classes, all people. We can argue about whether it hits certain people more or less, but everyone can at least feel inflation.
And so after the French election, White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain put out what I thought was a really kind of telling, signaling kind of tweet. He said, would you look at that? Macron, with a 30% approval rating, ended up winning re-election because the country hated Marine Le Pen more than they hated him. He didn't say that's our strategy to go in with 30% and run against somebody that they hate more than us, but it was very clear that that's what he was saying. So when you look at these numbers, previously, in a less polarized time, you would say, well, this party is dead in the water. There's absolutely no way they can win re-election in 2024. But if France and the world's polarization and the U.S. polarization is any guide, perhaps that's no longer true. What's your read on that?
I tend not to look at French elections to project future U.S. elections. It's usually not a good way to go about it. But what I find is interesting, let's look at the midterms here. If you look at President George W. Bush in 2004, he was, going into those midterms going to that presidential was extremely unpopular. Going into his 2002 midterms, he was okay. Going into the 2006 midterms, that's when the Republicans lost the majority. It was a disaster for them. And then you look at President Obama in 2012, his approval ratings weren't as bad as President Biden's or President Trump's at the point of the midterms, but they were certainly not great. And he went on to, had a rough midterm in 2012, the Democrats did, but went on and slugged on from there. You look at where President Trump was, right? Like we were talking about his approval ratings, going into the midterms and how much was it going to drag down, and it certainly dragged down. So I think President Biden, this is going to hurt the midterms. I think it's an open question based on the last 20 years about how much it's going to hurt or not hurt the Republicans in 2024 or the Democrats in 2024, just because, there's like 500 million political life cycles between now and then.
Are there any figures from this poll, or as somebody who's been tracking these trends in prior polls that we haven't talked about yet, that really stand out to you, Scott?
I hear it mentioned a while, the generic ballot, which is something we track, and it's consistently tracked over the last 40, 50 years. The last time we've seen the generic ballot this good for the Republicans, it was 2010. And that was the 2010 Tea Party takeover. And so I think we're going to see 20, 30 Republican seats. I mean, that's what the Decision Desk HQ News Nation projection shows, is if the election held today, Republicans take 20 or 30 seats, which would certainly mean Republican House controls, and not by a few seats, by a lot, and a pretty good chance to hold the Senate. So that generic ballot is a good barometer for what we think it's going to look like this fall. And the last time it looked like this for the Republicans, they won the House and the Senate. And so something to keep an eye on, a little bit, see the forest for the trees here a little bit, looking at those numbers.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Yeah, interesting stuff, Scott. And thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we will have more Rising right after this. Stick around.